So, good afternoon. Uh, Basically, I want to welcome you, and we are waiting for our guests to take a seat over here. The speakers we will have here this afternoon on the theme Global Economy, How Fair and Free Trade Can... No, sorry, how fair and free can trade just be? So our first speaker is Mr. Carmelo Abela. He is the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade Promotion of the Republic of Malta. He's basically the second of the right. Then we have Mr. M.G. Akbar, the Minister of State. He's number two, Mr. Akbar, the Minister of State for External Affairs of the Republic of India. He's well known as M.G. Akbar, I believe. Then we have Koichi Ai, Mr. Koichi Ai. On the right side, he is Acting Director General of the Japan Institute of International Affairs in Tokyo. Welcome. And last but not least, basically the first is Mr. Jeffrey Sachs from the United States. He is Quetelet Professor of Sustainable Development of Columbia University in New York. Welcome, everybody. We have a broad theme about the global economy. I must say, I'm Michelle de Waard. I'm a journalist in international economics and foreign affairs for quite a while. And I must say that words like capitalism, globalism, liberalism, even democracy, and of course free markets and free trade have become a little bit suspicious in our part of the world. We are talking about the global economy, but in the western part of Europe there is a lot of suspicion, and that has led to populist movements, of course also in the United States. Maybe the biggest populist is now in the White House, and there are some populists in London, in the Conservative Party. In big countries like France and Germany, also the Netherlands, small country, they are mainly in the opposition, in parliament. And then in some Eastern European countries, there are also populists governing. They are anti-elite, and basically I have a couple of questions that I would love to debate with the panel and with you. What are the causes of this dissatisfaction and how to tackle them? Because they have big consequences for our economic growth and for our well-being as a people. Having said that, capitalism, globalism, and liberalism have brought and are bringing us a lot of growth and wealth. But there is a lot of criticism. So, here's the role of politics. We have a few distinguished politicians in the panel. What is the role politicians, government have to play in setting the rules for the market and setting the rules for the redistribution of wealth? Because inequality is one of the drivers of the dissatisfaction. So, to start with the panel, everybody of you I would like to invite to give a short statement about something I've said about the theme. You are free to choose what you want. Maybe the first one, Mr. Sachs. And if you all made a few statements, then we can have a discussion also with the panel, between the panel and you, of course.
Thank you.
Yes, please, may I invite you?
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and honored to be part of this panel. I think there are three kinds of anxieties displayed in different relative proportions in different parts of Europe and the United States that are at play in this concern about globalization. By far, the biggest is actually not international trade or finance, but is people, migration. And there's no doubt in my mind that the refugee issue in Europe and broader demographic changes of changing population and a lot of migration pressures into Europe is by far the #1 driver of the so-called populist parties here, because they are overtly anti-refugee and anti-migrant parties. That's almost their core cause. And perhaps this is quite similar. Donald Trump really campaigned heavily on his attacks on foreigners, not just America First, but really attacks on the illegal migrants, which is very powerful populist politics in the US as well. The second factor is rising inequality, and trade has something to do with that, as does technological change. But we're in an era where the skill premium, so-called, of higher education has increased substantially. People that have a high school degree or less generally are in unstable employment and stagnant or falling real incomes. Trade plays a part of that, because when Europe and the US trade with China and India, as trade has expanded, this has widened the income inequality in the US and Europe. And so there's an anti-trade sentiment that can be provoked. It's not the right answer, but it can be provoked. And the third element that is causing anxiety, and probably in my country the most, in the United States, is the rise of China, and I would say the rise of Asia more generally, because this was supposed to be the America century, but the America century is over, and America doesn't like that. And so it's got a complete neurosis about China. It will about India soon. And this is part of the neurotic state of a leading country that sees that other countries are catching up. So most of this is not I would say, a grown-up or rational reaction. It is an emotional, visceral reaction that plays into nationalism and xenophobia. When it comes to the migrants, I think that the real issue of the refugees in Europe is not about migration of refugees. It's about wars in the Middle East that the United States has caused that led to a lot of migration. And since Europe doesn't have a foreign policy, unfortunately, it wasn't able to do anything to calm the Middle East. Basically, the US has riled up the Middle East. That's on Europe's border, and that has created a political crisis here. I have no doubt that countries need to police their borders, however, and to have limits on migration, because otherwise rich countries would be completely overwhelmed by the desire of poor people to come in. And so the politics is unsettled because there's no good answer, and because the migration is actually a symptom of a bigger problem, which is the wars on Europe's periphery, which Europe has been unwilling or unable or even complicit in causing. When it comes to trade, the fact of the matter is trade has brought tremendous wealth, and we even lucked into having a rule-based trading system in WTO, and this is a great gift. And now the US is probably the leading actor trying to break the rule-based trading system in a number of ways. Why? Well, partly because now it understands that under a rule-based trading system, countries like India and China become quite strong, grow rapidly, and that's not necessarily to the strategic interests of those who want to be far and away number one. But there's a second factor, and I'll just come to a conclusion. The gap of income widens with trade, but you don't handle that by closing trade or by making absolutely absurdly naive demands on China. You have to spend an extra $100 billion on us and so forth. You handle the inequality through redistribution of income internally. America's filled with...
May I interrupt
Yeah, I'll just
you?
finish
Yeah.
here. America's filled with rich people who got very rich on trade, but they run the politics, so they keep getting tax cuts rather than paying their taxes. And that's really what's going on this side. And then finally, on this question of the rising powers and the United States neuroticism about this, there is absolutely nothing to do about it except to learn to live with reality, which is you don't get to be so dominant and stay so dominant in the world. Fortunately, prosperity is spreading, and the reality is if you're 4.4% of the world's population, as the United States is, you're going to have competitors.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mr. Akbar, would you be so nice to react? Or maybe you have some other arguments about the causes of this, this critical movement or attitude against free markets, free trade, rise of populism, although I'm not sure if India has...
Thank you very much, first, for the invitation to be in such an august conference and an even more august panel. This is an afternoon where we are throwing open ideas, I hope. That's the basic purpose, to examine them. And if you want to get a little ahead in this purpose, my first suggestion would be to try and examine the meaning of the words and terms we use. Unless we do that, we are not going to get anywhere. Let me just take a very obvious terms that we've used and re-examine them. We use the term free trade. What precisely is free about this trade? It's not free at all. What we are looking for is equitable trade. We are looking at a situation where the world is not dominated by inheritances, which have in the past. And we who have suffered colonialism know precisely what it means, what gunboat diplomacy was all about. So if we are going to move to a democratic century in which equity is going to be important, we have to re-examine these terms. Even refugees, which Jeffrey used just now. I mean, you can find any reason, but there was no history of people from Syria wanting to flee to Europe before the conflict. Yeah. They were poor then as well. They didn't want to leave home. The first consequence of war is death. The second consequence of war is refugees. And who knows that better than Europe with its own history? So these are consequences of things that have happened. May I just switch to another aspect of this global populism or destabilization or turbulence or whichever word which we want to use to describe our present situation, which is the use of the middle class and how the middle class is reacting to it. I would suggest very strongly that as long as we treat the middle class as an economic phenomenon, we will not understand the full dimensions of its angst. The middle class is also an education phenomenon. It is not simply an economic phenomenon. And to check in the neighborhood, just to give you an example from the neighborhood, my own view is that the formation of the middle class, which finally created European domination across the world, began next door with Gutenberg. What the printing press combined with, of course, another parallel discovery, which was cheap paper, without which the printing press may not have had the impact it had. It led to something slow but extraordinarily historic, which was it led to the democratization of knowledge. It took knowledge away from the elites, particularly within the church, in our case within the temples or within the madrasa, and gave it over for the first time in history to quote-unquote ordinary people. And it is this knowledge which slowly created language, created books, seeped slowly, and eventually created the Industrial Revolution, through which Europe became a world power. And this is really the search for education is one of the dominant facts of change that exist in countries like mine. The people who have been left behind are not looking at free money, are not looking at donations, but they demand education as a right, because education is the true route towards economic emancipation, and particularly women. Yeah. Particularly women. We have actually made the gender emancipation and gender empowerment at the heart of our economic change policies and the heart of our drive against harsh poverty. And in fact, if you want to go back in history, one of the reasons why the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire could not compete with changing Europe is because they rejected printing. The reasons are different. Yeah. It had nothing to do with religion, by the way. It had everything to do with trade unions.
Yeah,
and
I
the
think
Khatib.
This is very big,
but
important.
It was the fact that they could not create the middle class. Yeah. In powerful empires which had, I mean, they were great powers because they were ahead in metallurgy. Yeah. They were great powers because they understood how to create weapons.
It's interesting that you mentioned this from your perspective, the middle class, because in the West, some Western countries, we have this idea that the middle class is eroding in the system.
The middle class, ma'am, just to complete the point, has given our modern world a new meaning to professionalism, created hundreds of new professions which didn't exist. The middle class feels economically active, empowered, because it knows the truth that it has created the modern world. And therefore, when the middle class is denied, and the rising new middle classes, shall we say, are denied through policies which have been well defined in that obnoxious phrase, the trickle-down theory. Right? What is the trickle-down theory which is ruling debate in economic symposia? What does it mean? It means that those who have swimming pools will get a waterfall, and those who are dying of thirst will get a trickle. It's simply not sustainable, and we won't allow it. Therefore, the world, if it wants sustainable growth, has to have equity, has to have an understanding that you are not going to be able to get away by leaving huge swaths of the population behind, by creating a handful of billionaires who control 60% of the world's wealth.
Yeah, you definitely have.
Will not continue.
I think you both, thank you very much, mentioned so very many arguments. Maybe there are some people in the public who wants to react on a specific topic already. Not dark. Yes?
Hello, I'm James Sproul. I'm from a think tank called the Gotham in London. I'm just curious because, of course, we're at a time in this world that's very interesting economically in terms of we're creating wealth in very, very many new ways. And that's, I think, inevitable when you've got big technological changes and companies come up as a result of that. So given that those companies are developed by people and not by governments because they don't have the creativity and nor are they there to take the sort of risks with taxpayers' money that is naturally taken establishing those companies. So you complain that a very few people have a lot of wealth. Well, that's a natural outcome of the transition from the sort of industrial-based to the more intellectually based economy that we're in. And I think if we were to decide, oh, I know what we'll do is we'll strip Bill Gates of his money or whatever else. He's giving it away anyway. But if we're going to strip him of his money, we are essentially saying we do not want that new kind of world. And I think that's a really bad approach.
I'm sorry, that is absolutely not true. I began by saying that we must understand the meaning of the words we use. And that's certainly not, because we in India are participating in that wealth creation through our technologies. So that's really not the point. The point is that their ability to create the YouTubes or whatever it is, the big companies, has come from a knowledge base. You cannot leave 9/10 of the world ignorant and create knowledge domination. You have to share knowledge. That is what Africa wants.
That's happening a lot. I mean, the number of people who have access to IT, access to the world, I mean, it's increased exponentially in the last 20 years. I think it's fantastic. And if Mo Ibrahim has made a lot of money by giving a lot of people in Africa a telephone, that's a very, very good thing. Certainly not African governments were never going to do that. That was a private sector company that was going
to do that. No, I think you underestimate African governments.
I beg your pardon?
You let me just tell you that you certainly underestimate African governments. And you have to look at Rwanda not on the basis of what happened 15 years ago, 20 years ago, but what is happening today. Change is coming.
I do have another question over here. It's from the Slido system we use here. It's on the there. You can see it. There is one question I want to put. I want to tell you now, because it is about Africa. What is the biggest challenge concerning the Africa continent, and how we can help its inhabitants? Somebody in the public asks that to fulfill your argument about Africa. For example, what does Mr. Abela, who has a lot of experience, he also was, he's the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Malta, but he was also the Minister of Home Affairs. So you had a lot to deal with the migrant situation.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be in this distinguished panel as well. First, you mentioned the word populism and populist party. I think this is a consequence of what's happening in today's world. While saying this, it's not a question of justifying the acts or the narrative that some populist party or populists preach. It's not that, but we have to look at the consequences that these populists are preaching. And definitely the issue of migration, as Mr. Sachs said in the beginning, it's mainly the main theme in recent years for populism, for the rise of populism. You mentioned the number of countries and elections and the fear that we had before these elections about the outcome of results and what will happen after these results. So I think we have to look at the consequences rather than concentrating on the reaction of and the aftermath of these reactions. So I think what's happening today is, and we are talking about free trade, fair trade. We need to have just trade, equitable, as Mr. Akbar said in his remarks. So it's a question whether we are giving the opportunity, especially to our younger generation, to reach their aspirations, because everyone has aspirations. Whether we are giving them the opportunity to, and the hope that one day they will manage, that their aspirations, they can acquire them in a fair world. Because I believe that, and I think I was taught that nothing comes free in life. So someone is paying. If we call free trade with the word free, but it's not free because someone is paying. Either can be the individual, usually those who are the most needy might be paying, not in terms of money, but be paying in terms of not having what are even the basic needs. Or even developing countries might be paying for what we are calling free trade. So we need that free trade yes, exists, but it has not only to be free, it has to be fair, just, equitable in today's world. Now, you mentioned the African continent. I think that first and foremost, those who are not coming from Africa, first and foremost, we need to respect the African continent. We need to have a fresh look at what's happening in the African continent. I think that there is huge potential of development in Africa. There is change. I had the opportunity to also personally meet some colleagues that are becoming more pro-business in the sense that they want to have investment in Africa. So let me talk a bit about the perspective of us Europeans in respect of the African continent. I think we should talk about trade, not aid, with Africa, first and foremost. We should engage with the African continent, not because we have an issue with migrants coming to Europe, but because we want to invest, we want to help them grow, we want that their population have a future.
Is there the European program which Merkel and Macron and other EU politicians developed as a kind of
I think we need to change also the narrative when it comes to the African continent. Because I had attended meetings where supposedly the discussion was or had to concentrate more on trade, on investment, but it ended up discussing the issue of migration once again. So first and foremost, we have to change the narrative. Secondly, we have to implement. I think in Europe we are, when it comes to implementation, we are not that fast. So we have other countries investing in Africa, which is good. I'm not contesting that. But we Europeans, we would love and we would like to invest in Africa, but maybe due to bureaucracy, due to other things, we are not managing as fast as we should, like other countries as well. So I think there is a multitude of issues that you mentioned in the beginning. And although we are talking about trade, but there are a lot of other components that we need to tackle as well when we are dealing with trade.
Maybe Africa is most helped by fair trade with countries in Europe.
Well, we have to be frank with each other, I think. I mean, when we are imposing tariffs, I don't know whether it's free, it's fair, or whatever it can call. I mean, so at the same time that we want to invest in Africa, maybe we should rethink the tariffs that we are charging to them as well.
Yeah, yeah. How is Mr. I looking at this subject?
Well, as is apparent from preceding discussions, the topic we are discussing today in this session is multifaceted and it has a wide range of issues. And I would prefer to pick one or two or three, perhaps, important issues that we can discuss among them. But obviously, the implication of anti-globalization or the concerns over trade and its implications on income distribution goes beyond trade policy and global economic policies. It has implications on future of democracy and international order, as was partly suggested this morning by President Kiska's presentation at the beginning of this meeting. And it also have relevance on the relationship between individual and state, how the relationship is conceived. And also, I think there is implication for the role of elites in the age of populism. I guess in the line of discussion we had, we have to define who's elites, but there are also points of interest that we might take on. But if I were to choose one topic, I would echo what Professor Sachs said at the beginning about income distribution and problem inherent in it. Traditional way of dealing with this is the income distribution is a matter of national policy and is dealt with in the framework of each individual country's tax policy, income distribution policy of any kind. On the other hand, trade is considered interstate issue where the rules are established through international agreements, parties to which are states. So there are two separate approaches to the single issue. When you take income in distribution we see today as a result of the global trade. So my suggestion that I pose to the panel and to the audience is whether there is another way of dealing with this income in distribution in the world, in the age of globalization, not just leave it to the national policy to address that issue individually in each country, but whether there's a way or system under which these issues can also be resolved in wider perspective.
According to this subject, there is an interesting question about your country that has also to do with redistribution. How is Japan going to handle or stop decline of population if they have no migration policy?
Reversing.
Maybe I can enlarge it a little bit, because if there is a diminishing of population, wealth also gets into problems. So how to generate enough growth, economic growth?
I think you have to accept the reality that if the population is in decline, the gross production will have to go down with it. But the real issue, and also the declining population in itself is not healthy for the country. So there are many policies undertaken to address that issue. But the real problem, perhaps, is we need to have innovation and the reorganization of structural setup of the nation's economy, so that whatever the population is, we can adjust to the new situation with a vibrant economy. That's the more important issue that our country should be discussing. And I would not concentrate on the raw number of population, whether it's in decline or not.
I think it's actually a good point to just spend a little bit of time on, because in the high-income countries, the fertility rate is quite low, and in Japan, well below the replacement rate, which is 2 children per woman. So the population in Europe and the population in Japan is in decline, and it will be a significant decline over time. By the way, that doesn't mean living standards decline. It means the aggregate population declines, not the standard of living per person. It poses a challenge, however. And from Japan's point of view, the challenge is whether to have migrants or not, or to accept an aging population, which of course is inevitable with low fertility. And Japan is choosing clearly to do that, because Japan does not want migration. Japan wants Japan for Japan, and this is a very deep part of society, and it is, I think, an unquestioned part of, other than on a small fringe, where there is some migration, but not a deep change of population structure. For Europe, the situation is the same. Europe's population has peaked. It is not only is it in decline, but the neighborhood population is rising rapidly and has been rising rapidly for the last 50 years. So at the end of World War II, Europe had twice the population of Africa and the Middle East combined. Now Europe has half the population of Africa and the Middle East. And that gap will continue to grow because Africa's population is soaring and the Middle East population is soaring. This is basic demography. That will put tremendous pressure on migration into Europe. This will continue to disrupt politics here. Europe will have a hard time even setting borders, but it is a demographic, and Europe's population does, most of it does not want a huge change of the ethnicity and the source of population in Europe. And that's going to drive population, that's going to drive politics here in an intensive way.
Yeah, right.
My advice to Europe, which I strongly disagree with the line, by the way, of trade not aid, because I think it's a slogan but not a reality for Europe. Two things. One, don't let the U.S. muck up the Middle East anymore. Stop the wars, because otherwise you're just going to keep getting overrun by migrants that you don't want. And second, give a lot of help to Africa to educate the population, to educate the kids, which Europe is not doing, I can tell you. It does not have any sane, smart, quantified policy to help Africa to gain the education that the minister has exactly said is the key, is rightly said is the key to development. Europe has no sensible sensible policy relative to Africa other than keep your migrants at home, we police the Mediterranean, we pay you to stop migration. This is not a policy.
Here is an interesting question from the public. Is populism here the biggest the biggest barrier to fair trade? Because that is, with the whole criticism about migrants in Europe, that's one of the biggest drivers. You also explained that behind populism. But is that a serious barrier to fair trade?
Well, keep a big distinction between trade and migration. If you close trade, you're going to have more people show up at the borders, first of all. So if you're not trading with the rest of the world, you're going to create an even bigger migration crisis. So these are really two different issues, is trade and migration. On migration, the main thing you want to do, especially if you're a demographically stable or declining country that is therefore likely to receive migrants that the public does not want to receive in huge numbers, you better take care, first, not to have wars on your periphery, and second, to make sure that your neighborhood is developing economically. Because if it's not developing economically, you're going to have absolutely no way to stop this, no matter how much Coast Guard there is in the Mediterranean. This is going to be an overwhelming reality.
Yes,
and
but
Europe
populism...
does not, and Europe doesn't have a policy on this, frankly, because Europe
here populism is very threatening, because take the situation now in Italy. It looks like as if two very populist parties started to make a coalition. What does that mean?
Chaos.
Yeah, chaos. But that means they are anti-migrants. They want to. They are also basically anti-growth, because they are so critical about the euro and the monetary union and everything. Although that is also a very important driver behind growth. So that in this case, populism is pretty threatening for having free trade, fair trade. How to tackle that?
May I ask a question of anyone here? I'm very curious, and honestly, I'm deeply puzzled. What does populism mean? We all, I think, in this room are committed to democracy. My old-fashioned dictionary told me that democracy is vox populi. So what precisely does populism mean? I mean, why is the voice of the people a negative fact?
what it means in the current context is Mr. Trump, who's definitely a bad thing. I'll tell you from living with him, because we have instability, confusion, government by tweet, and danger. So yes, you can have, in our case, we have a reality TV showman who is incapable of governing, but he's sold a demagogic message to the American people, which is that the rest of the world is to blame for our problems, whether it's Mexican rapists or Islamic terrorists or Chinese unfair traders. So populism in the American context means selling a message of America first, but that's a message not of let's do our job well, that's a message that the others are the problem. And that's a very dangerous message. And so this is a xenophobic
Shouldn't we create
message.
another word for this, rather than deny the roots of democracy?
We could.
Can I say something on this?
What do you suggest?
We could.
You could say megalomania, you can say anything you like. All I'm saying is that, after all, people have emerged as leaders in many contexts and so on.
Well, to be
But,
honest,
I don't know. I see President Trump as a person who's been elected by the American people.
By 25% of them.
Well, whatever, the democratic system has got to power, so we live with those who are elected.
Can I say something on this? Well, first of all, I said regarding Africa that the European Union mainly should change the narrative. So I agree with what you said, that we should change the narrative. It doesn't mean that actually all this is happening. It is evident that we are not investing enough in Africa, although the main contributor and the main donor to Africa is the European Union.
It is.
We have to say that. We have to say that the US is also not doing basically what maybe it used to do in the past, to also be a leader also to stop wars. Actually, if we talk about the Middle East and what's happening at the moment, unilateral decisions are creating more instability. So how can one stop what's happening? And I'm not justifying any kind of violence, but I mean the decisions that, or the decision that was taken unilaterally is causing more trouble and more violence. So how can one stop that and then talk about trade, for example, in Palestine where it is much needed, because trade will provide work for the Palestinians first and foremost. So I think when we talk about migrants or refugees, and there is a difference. Mr. Akbar first mentioned that Syrians never wanted to leave Syria, and he's absolutely right. It's the consequence of the war in Syria, and most of them will return when stability will be back in Syria. Hopefully, we hope it very soon rather than later. So, but then in Europe, I'm not going to speak about the differences between EU member states, how to tackle the issue internally, because that will take much time. But I think we are not exploiting positively the migrant phenomena, because there are member states in Europe that need more workers. So, and that is in line with what was being said before, that the population is shrinking, so we need more workers. And if I take the example of my country, our population is increasing mainly to two things. First, because people are living more, and secondly, because of foreign workers, because of foreigners that are opting to come and live in Malta. And we need more workers as well, because we have an economic growth. Last year it was 6.6%. This year is going to be also the highest in the European Union. So we need more workers, and we are not the only country in the EU where we need more workers. So when we talk about the issue of migrants, the prevailing argument is that we need to send them back to their country of origin. And we don't ask the question, well, do we need them to also, let's say, be part of our workforce. Maybe
would you call the integration of migrants in your country a success? Because you have work.
I think that's because there is work. Work is, we have to look at from both sides. So there is the native population. If there is work and they have work, they will not blame migrants that they are taking their jobs. And of course, we need to also make sure that migrants are being paid the right pay, not being exploited. And so it is both ways. When there is lack of work, the native population will start blaming the migrants that they are taking their work. If there is enough work, so let's say that mainly everyone is happy because the native population has work and we are providing also work for others. So that's, I think, a happy medium in the end.
But it's a silly situation because in the Netherlands, where I live, but also in Germany, where there is a tremendous positive economic situation, so lots of work being created, and still lots of criticism about the migrants. And that has to do, one of the arguments is that it's so difficult to integrate them.
Well, I think that we have to agree that there are cultural differences. And integration, we should not look at integration only from one side. Even here, integration should be that the local population need to understand the culture of the migrants or of the refugees. And likewise, the migrants and the refugees needs to understand the culture of the country that they are living in. Not to become one, but to respect each other and to understand each other. So it's a question of both the native population and the migrants or refugees need to understand each other better, our culture, our way of living, to respect each other better. Sure. So I think it's not only one way. We should write many policies. We should have multitude of papers, and we call them policies. But actually, we need to work on them to make them happen. So maybe if I make an attempt to what do we mean by populism, for example? If we portray, or if someone portrays migration as a negative all the time, and then it becomes part of the narrative of some of the population, continuously repeating that, and then you have parties or individuals exploiting that, maybe that's populism because we are not, let's say, educating or giving the right perspective of migration.
And that's a responsibility of the politicians.
It is the responsibility of the of politicians, of all politicians, not only those who of mainstream parties. And maybe the birth of extreme right or extreme or extremism, for example, is because we're not doing enough to explain what migration and the hardship that these people, because after all we are talking about human beings, those who risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean, it's not a joke. We need also to talk about the criminal activity that's going on, because there are people, the human traffickers and smugglers, that are making good money out of these people as well. So it's a criminal activity, but these people are basically risking their life.
We may be, sorry, Jason? Yes. We just one point on this issue. We may be underestimating one phenomenon, which I think is really having a major impact on thinking and on dialectic. And that is the role of fear.
Yes.
The role of fear, which has not simply the obvious fear of jobs, that is a well-known phenomenon, but terrorists have created a very, very barriers of fear between people. And there is an underlying sense that the migrant is tomorrow's terrorist. Mm-hmm. And that is actually having a great impact, and we must understand the social impact of the rise of terrorism that is taking place simultaneously across all plural societies. all plural societies, societies that believe in social harmony, societies that have worked very hard to erase their own memories and their own past in order to create a new future. And suddenly, fears that had become dormant again are rising up and extracting a political price, extracting a social price, and in fact, even extracting a price from victims.
To confirm what MJ is saying is that in Europe we experienced, unfortunately, a number of terrorist attacks. There were politicians that were portraying that these were affected by migrants. When you look at all the terrorist attacks, the vast majority were homegrown people that, were born in that particular country, and they were not migrants. Only one case was that there was a migrant that crossed to Europe and managed to go to a number of countries. But out of so many attacks, only one came from a migrant. So this is the fear that some, for their own reasons, are trying to instill in the population. And let's face it, our citizens are afraid of terrorism, are afraid of the consequences of terrorism. And today it's not an army coming to attack, but it can be a car, it can be a truck that goes into a shopping mall. And
how to tackle it, this
Pardon?
fear? Now, how to tackle this fear?
We need to tackle this fear by saying the truth all the time, by having policies of integration, not on paper, but actually being implemented, by integration and by appreciating each other's culture. It's not a fight between religions. We need to appreciate and we need to live together irrespective of our religion. We have the same needs after all, irrespective of which religion or faith we profess.
May I make one point on populism? Populism created President Trump and not the other way around. So with the eventual departure of President Trump, the problem doesn't dissipate. It will remain there. The populism, I think, is an expression of those who feel or believe that their voice have not been heard by people who are making policies in capitals, Washington, Tokyo, elsewhere. So unless this issue is seriously tackled, I think we will have eventually have problem of maintaining credibility of the institutions, political systems and institutions that we think should work if it is operated properly. And that brings the question of the elites. These people representing populism are saying that elites haven't been doing their job right and do it right. So perhaps, as was suggested earlier in the opening session, we should have introspective discussion on where things got wrong and what should be corrected if we are to tackle this issue from up front.
That's definitely true. It's Mr. Akbar is right when he said, of course, populism means the voice of the people. And in the United States, but also in France and also in the Netherlands, where there is a big support for populism. It of course has to do with government politics. But in a lot of countries, the causes are different. For example, if you take Germany, in the new coalition, there is a lot of dissatisfaction in Germany that people can't find a proper and payable home. The coalition partners, the SPD and the Merkel's party, they want to tackle the AfD, the populist party in Germany that has grown and is now the biggest opposition party in parliament. So they are spending now a lot of money of building cheaper houses. In the Netherlands, we have the same. That are, of course, very long processes. And in between, maybe you can ask the question, which somebody in the public does: how do we fight Trump's? No, is Donald Trump? Is he causing a problem for our economic growth and for having fair trade? Because he is, well, he is tackling the multilateral trade system, to give an example, and a couple of other things. But Trump, Mr. Trump, I look at you because Mr. Trump is a populist. He speaks. He speaks for a lot of Americans.
Very difficult. Let's once we get sort of opinions out of the way. It's very difficult to argue with a person who's been elected, who's defending his stuff, who's defending the programs on the basis of which he got elected. One thing that if you look at it objectively, is he has said all these things that he is doing. He said it during the campaign. I honestly can't think of anything that he didn't say, on this, except maybe he didn't discuss North Korea or Korea to the extent. So we have to just wait and see what an elected leader of any country, and it's not very wise to be judgmental about people. We as governments have to deal with them, and deal with them on the basis of the positions he arouses, he has taken and will continue to take. So let's see what happens. Those who go around predicting the end of the world very often tend to be a bit excessive in their view, So we shall see.
As policymakers, which you two are, I'm wondering if you look at Europe, United States. You mentioned, of course, in your country how very important education is. What would be an agenda to counter this broadly dissatisfaction?
I think that cooperation is much better than working on our own on this. Even when it comes to trade, I mean, some are saying that we are risking entering a trade war. Now, is this helpful to the world or to today's problems or not? I mean, I do respect elected people and that were elected on their program, but of course, then there is the international agenda and perspective, and whether for the common good, not only for our own good. I mean, first and foremost, definitely, I represent my country, I represent my government and my people. So I have to look at the interest of who elected me and the government I'm representing. But as a politician, I also have a responsibility to the common good, which is not only my country and my people and my government, but also the international community. Even because in the long run, or medium to long run, the effects will come to haunt us, or we will feel back the effects of them. Now, if I'm talking and coming from, let's say, Malta, imagine that this counts more for the US. So I think that we need to not only represent our people, our country, and take first and foremost the interest of our people and country, but we have a responsibility in the world as well. And creating trade wars at this point in time, I don't think that it is conducive to the common good, or it will solve some problems internationally. It might maybe be effective locally, but we have to wait and see also in this respect. So I think that
Here
cooperation
we
in
have
this
an
respect
interesting
is
question of the public, because it enhances your what you're saying. Is Trump hurting the U.S. economy midterm by strengthening industries of the past rather than of the future?
We really should ask the American president.
Nobody elected Donald Trump to rip up a universally agreed agreement on climate. Nobody elected Donald Trump to rip up a universally agreed set of rules of international trade. Nobody elected Donald Trump to rip up a universally agreed policy with Iran. The man's a disaster and a danger. But the biggest problem for Europe is that Europe seems absolutely incapable of a response, because 28 countries cannot coordinate. And this is an institutional failure that is really profound and very worrying, because somehow, while the market was put together, the politics are falling apart. And this, I would say, is Europe's biggest problem, which is you need a policy. And you need to be able to say to Trump, no. And nobody can. And frankly, send over all your leaders and let them grovel in front of Trump. He loves that. So he had Macron come, played with him a little bit, picked up a little dandruff. He had Merkel come next. This is the game of this guy. Where's Europe able to have a European position? Now the U.S. says we're going to put on extraterritorial sanctions. This is illegal. This is a violation of international law. It's a violation of WTO. And what is Europe saying? Well, the big companies say, okay, we won't trade with Iran in violation of what we agreed in the JCPOA. The European governments are...
Maybe we should ask the floor. What?
But I'm making a point, which is, please, you have to stand up to bullying, because it's dangerous for the world. Are we just going to say, oh, the U.S., do what you want on climate, do what you want on Iran, do what you want on trade rules? No, you can't. But Europe can't speak, unfortunately, right now.
Is there
so
somebody
this,
in the public who wants to react? You, for example?
Thank you. Philip Blond from Res Publica in England. I was particularly struck, Professor Sachs, by your remark about European division. But that division, as of course you know, is reflected back in the United States. According to Pew Research, Americans have never been as polarized as they are now. And what's interesting, if you look at all the populist revolts, all of them make economics secondary to questions of value and questions of political identity. And actually, the origin of all of our present discontents is a collapse of Western ideas or consensus around values, a loss of the common good, and the capture of that common good by a liberal ideology that people palpably have shown. I'm thinking of Branko Milanovic's work, has actually distributed goods in ways that don't feel equitable. So prior to this discussion, what we need in the West, if we're going to restore the order, that you speak so eloquently about, is a discussion about what sort of values can we hold in common. Because the thing that has divided us, the thing that has the first order, if you like, is the fact that people's value fragmentation is at unprecedented levels. And if you look at Britain, the Brexit vote is starting to mirror the kind of fragmentation you see in the United States, and the same is true in France, the same is true in Italy. Because economics is ultimately at origin a question of value, what do you think can be done in the West to actually restore this notion of a common value set, rather than just repeat the need for it?
Let me make one preliminary point before so I can evade your hard question. Europe has two problems. One is, if we say the differences of view, class, other divisions, but it also has 28 countries, at least for now. Maybe it'll have 27 or 29, depending on other dynamics. The problems in the world actually cannot be solved by 28 states acting independently in this small geography. This is a real problem. China, India, the United States, aside from all the other issues, have a big polity and have a big weight and have a big advantage, frankly. And if Europe can't stay a union, but not just a union in economic terms, but a union in political terms, Europe, and if Brexit is the sign of further disarray, value differences will remain, but the capacity of this part of the world to be effective will diminish tremendously. That's my that is really my worry. And you cannot run a society of 450 million people by a committee of 28. And this is what's happening right now. And it means no decisions, no ability to react, big division, big unhappiness. And I think, the idea that the frustration, say, of Brexit was a rebellion against Brussels is not right. It's a rebellion against the incoherence of a group that can't act effectively. It's not Brussels per se, because the bureaucracy is so weak in Brussels. It doesn't count even right now, because this is being run by heads of state and committee, which is not working.
But that's quite a pessimistic conclusion, because after
may I push back on that, because I think you're begging the question.
No, I'm raising another problem.
No, because in human history, 28 states, in fact more states than that, have come together over all manner of things. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the international order that's falling apart. The point I'm trying to make, and I've studied Brexit quite acutely, the fundamental rationale isn't about Brussels being ineffective. It's actually the fear that Brussels is too effective.
No, I know, but that's false.
But false perceptions can become politically true. What I'm saying to you is that you're not answering the question at base. Europe is unified before, otherwise we wouldn't have the European Union. And actually at various points there's been majorities in the European Union for it. If we are to defend Western unity, we need a new value set, because what previously used to glue us together, general agreement for kind of the type of liberalism we've had, no longer works. So my question, and the more profound question, is what is the new ideology that could bring us together, not an empirical description of our current fragmentation?
I don't think that there is a profound failure of economic institutions or even of values about them. Of course, I think that there is a failure, as I described at the beginning, to confront the fact that our societies have become a lot more unequal. A lot of people have been left behind. Both Britain, but much more the United States, have been led by very wealthy and powerful interests, and not the people that are voted more rural, more working class, more lower class, voted for Brexit or voted for Trump. And so they're not going to get any results. Their lives are not going to be improved the way that they're hoping by the way they voted. But I have no doubt that there is as you say, both an identity and a class and a rural-urban issue that is part of this divide. To my view, this requires the kind of tools of social market economy that have proven highly effective and work in most of Europe, in fact, and are not the main barrier, because Europe has done a relatively better job than the massive rise of inequality in my country, but both the US and Britain, by the kind of policies that were followed, left a lot of people behind, and they felt it, and they reacted.
Can I add something?
Excuse me, Mr. I, do you agree with this view? What's the view of you as a Japanese towards the European Union?
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with this?
You mean the Brexit?
Pardon?
You mean the Brexit? Or
No, with the state of the EU.
Yes, of the current state of the EU.
You agree with
can,
Professor's analysis of...
Yes,
it was only the United Kingdom that left, and the rest is still trying pretty close to work together.
Yes.
As we see in the Iran case. But how do you view it from your perspective? That means from the other side of the world. How do you view that?
Well, I can only speak on it from my very limited experience of negotiating with the Commission on the EU-Japan Free Trade Agreement. Mm-hmm. It was excruciating experience for those of us on the other side. I think there is room for improvement on how the decision is made in Brussels. I'm happy with the end result, but the time it took was just amazing. So I can only speak my own experience, but there is room for improvement, I'm sure about that. Does that answer your question?
In the economic field, but also in the political field?
Excuse me?
In the economic field, and
it's the same thing.
Because you're talking about the trade
yes, it doesn't matter.
Situation.
It doesn't really matter.
Diplomats put things so much more nicely than academics.
Can I say something about this? I think that about the European Union, I think we have to go back in history first and foremost. How the EU developed. I mean, what was the purpose of creating the EU that we have today?
Peace.
It was peace. And I think we can say that for 70 years or so, we managed to guarantee peace. So let's say if that was the goal, we achieved that goal because this is the stretch of the longest stretch of in European history of peace. Now, when we try to go for the monetary union, not every member state has the euro as its currency. So I think that at that point in time, we needed to settle down the issue of the political direction. Do we want to have the European states of Europe? Or is it a number of individual countries working together or trying to work together on a number of issues, economic, trade, the currency, safeguarding peace and everything, you know? So the EU today, it's not the United States of America with 52 states but with one federal government. You have 28 member states with 28 governments. So this is one of the basic things that we need to remind ourselves. And it's not a question of, I'm not justifying the delays that we take in the bureaucratic things that we do, or I'm not just trying to justify to what Professor Sachs said, but it's reality after all. Now we need, I think at this point in time, and even in view of Brexit, we need to go to have a soul-searching exercise in Europe. Brexit came as a brick. Maybe we didn't expect it to happen. In the end, it happened. We need to respect the will of the people, of course. But it was a shock, I believe, for the European Union to have one of its member states and one of the major member states leaving the EU. Now, there are other countries who are knocking on the door of the European Union for accession. But really and truly, I think when we are in this position that one country is leaving, others want to join, but maybe the appetite to add new member states maybe is not there. Let's wait and see what will happen in the aftermath of Brexit, and then we talk about membership. So I think we need really to have this soul-searching exercise within the EU. Now, I'm one of those persons who would like to see the European Union playing a major role internationally, politically, especially in our neighborhood. I mean, the Middle East process has been there for 50, 60 years. Syria, the North Africa, especially what's happening in Libya. These are all situations that have a larger impact on the European Union, on Europe, but on the European Union as well. Yeah. So it's in our interest that we play a major role. I'm one of those who has been saying this within the structures of the European Union. Yeah. And talking about structures, I stop here, we have different structures. You have the Commission, which is not elected, but nominated by different member states. You have the Council, which in the Council you have the representatives of each national government, and you have the European Parliament, which at times these might be in conflict with what the Commission and the Council are doing. But so it's complicated as well.
But we also have the French-German couple, Merkel, Macron these days, that both have the objective to strengthen Europe, not only the monetary union and the euro, because it has to be completed with, for example, the banking union, but also in foreign policy and in the defense. Defense is,
yes, but
the
union is made up of 28, not just 2. And
no,
it is a union of states that we need to discuss the way forward. And although, of course, I have every respect for France and Germany, and I do applaud what they do, but it's a question of that we are 28 member states, and to move forward, we need to be together in this European project.
Yeah, but somewhere you have to have a beginning with a statement, with a plan, and Merkel and Macron are working now on that plan, and in June it will be discussed by the European leaders of the Council, and then there should be a broad discussion.
We'll see what happens then.
Yeah. It sounds a little bit skeptical if I...
No, because it depends whether we want to have a European Union as the US, or there are those who think that we should not go to have not go there. I mean, to be a union of states rather than become one, have like one government governing the whole of the European Union.
Well, to put a hot question from the public, I just got. Did the EU lose its way by expanding too quickly to become a competitive international trading bloc? I'm curious to the opinion of the 4 of you. Maybe Mr. Sachs.
I was a very big proponent of rapid expansion after 1989, and I'm very happy that Europe did expand and take Central European countries fairly rapidly into the European Union. I think this was a very good thing. On the other hand, I'm not so happy that NATO expanded all the way to the Russian border, because I think that was a provocation. So different things happened that I think probably didn't judge the circumstances properly. But the expansion of Europe politically was absolutely the will of the people then, and a very powerful and a very correct one. It's ironic that it's now under threat also in Eastern Europe, because I remember very vividly 1989 and what people were fighting for. And they were fighting for the return to Europe, and they were fighting for being part of a normal European culture, economy, and politics.
How do you explain the backlash?
And I wanted to respond to the minister, because I think your analysis is 100% correct. But I would say that the evolving global circumstances really compel Europe to move towards unity. And this is because we're not in a Cold War anymore. The US is not your protector. It cannot be your protector. The divergence of interests, the mess of the US, the changing challenges that Europe faces, and the fact that in this world you cannot solve problems at the scale even of a Germany or a France or the bigger countries. You need the 450 million people together. And because you're dealing with India, you're dealing with China, you're dealing with the US, not as your protector, but as a counterpart that will sometimes be your partner, sometimes not be your partner. And this becomes so evident that there has to be a capacity for foreign policy. Without it, it's so easy to play. And you look at these sanctions, to come back to that, totally illegal, but Europe can't muster a response. And that's a real shock. That's a lack of foreign policy.
We are running to the end of the debate, so I would like lots of questions. Maybe you.
Thank you very much, Frau Raunig from Austrian Foreign Ministry. Minister Akbar had the question, what is populism? And I would say it's simplified answers to complex issues, or simplified solutions, simplified explanations to complex issues. Coming back to the topic of Europe, unity of Europe, as the professor has said, or Brexit, unfortunately, populism very much in Europe goes hand in hand with nationalism, with isolationism. And we are facing a phenomenon that on the one hand, we have expanding China economically, gaining more and more power. On the other hand, we have a US that is going back to isolation. And then we have a Europe that is not united, that is too much struggling with its own, that has a very weak foreign policy. And on the other hand, it's clear that the challenges being between China and isolationist US, and having the refugees waiting, or the migrants waiting to come to Europe, the nationalists have an effect that is exactly the opposite of what they propose to the people. They say, we will make your nation stronger. No, they are weakening the states, because states alone, not Malta, even Germany, cannot face these problems. And therefore, Brexit is going into the completely wrong direction.
Oh, that was more or less a statement.
It was a comment, if this is allowed.
Thank you very much.
Yes, of course it's allowed.
Yes, a couple of other questions, please.
Next year you must keep him on the panel.
Maybe somebody could react about the future of Europe. Where must the continent?
Thank you very much. My name is Michal Kaczmeri. I'm with the American Chamber of Commerce here in Slovakia. I would like to switch debate back to the original question of the panel, which was how fair and free the trade can be. And I would like to relate to Minister Akbar's words on basically rephrasing that we need more equitable trade, which implies to me that that should be done on existing multilateral fora. On the other hand, what we see is the rise of unilateralism. We see the rise of me-first policies. So the question would be whether in the circumstances of today, when they're in this growing difference, we can actually aim for more free or more equitable trade. Thank you.
If I may comment on that, there has been no period in history where there hasn't been the tension of debate. So there will always be, thank God, more than one point of view on any issue. That is, again, is what democracy is all about. You argue your case, and then there is a jury and a judge, and eventually government policy emerges through that democratic process. So there have been these debates before. The debates will continue. Indeed, my version of equity may sharply differ from your version of equity. These are, after all, in a sense, intangibles. They're not concretized. However, you know, what is extremely important is that the impoverished of the world must believe that they are part of the narrative of rising prosperity. If they feel that they're being excluded from it, then there will be other consequences. Those other consequences can include migration. After all, it is in a sense an ode or a tribute to Europe that refugees want to come to Europe. They don't want to go anywhere else. Right? I mean, it's a sign of confidence in Europe's ability to give them shelter, to give them a decent life, to give them a free voice, things that they may or may not have had in their countries of origin. So this is all to the good. But the point is that you know, these problems are not solved merely by improving security. They are sorted out through policy and through engagement. I fear that, let's simply take the case of, a continent we are discussing. If the world does not give Africans, we all the time, every meeting that I go to or wherever, we all talk of Africa. At one place, I think it was a G20 meeting, I suggested let's stop talking about Africa and let's start talking about the African. And the moment you convert a problem into a human face, I think your ability to find solutions that are equitable and that are humanitarian actually improve. And that is really what many places across the world need.
Yeah, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to finish the discussion by this because it's 5:15. I want to thank the panel. I think there were a lot of problems which we couldn't solve, but there is a lot of food for thought. So thanks a lot. I just want to inform you that in the Danube space there is at 17:45 an en-garde towards European Defence Union, another interesting European topic. And there is in the Marie-Thérèse space, there is GLOBSEC chat, energy transition to the post-oil era, sharing the know-how. So I want to thank you very much, and also the panel. Thanks a lot.